Hi everyone, I'm Tessa Brown. I'm the Silviculture Performance Assessment Specialist with the Forest Science Planning and Practices branch. I'm here with Ellery Tetz, who is on a temporary assignment as the Silviculture Reporting Specialist. Today, we're going to be discussing new best management practices for results reporting. They are being driven by the Free Growing Working Group, so I'll be explaining the reasons behind the changes. Then, Ellery will outline the exact expectations. So we're going to be bouncing back and forth a little bit. All right, here's the outline for the presentation. Ellery will begin by explaining how the rollout of these best management practices is going to work. I'll then explain some background information so you can understand why these changes are so important. We will then outline the changes, starting with spatial reporting. We have changes to forest cover reporting and to silviculture treatment reporting. Then we'll move into some changes related to tree planting, including technique codes, objective codes, and stratification. I'm now going to hand it off to Ellery.
Thanks, Tessa. I'll begin with a high-level overview of the changes and how the rollout will work. There are 5 new changes to results reporting. These changes are being released as best management practices. As a result, this is just a soft rollout. It's meant to provide licensees with the necessary transition time before the changes become mandatory. The dates will vary for each change, either 2025 or 2026. These timelines were informed by feedback from licensees. We did extensive outreach to understand what would be feasible. Now, it's really important to understand that these changes, these BMPs, will only apply to new openings or new activities. There is no expectation to clean up previously reported blocks or to rebuild opening spatial in your internal databases. Until the changes become mandatory, they will be outlined in a results communications bulletin that's going to be posted on the same web page as the risks under guidance documentation. If you're on the results distribution list, you'll have received it in your email. As the changes become mandatory between 2025 and 2026, they will be incorporated into the results information submission specification documents. These are posted on this webpage as submission specifications data requirements. Now it's important to note that there are 4 versions of the risk currently. One for woodlots, one for government-funded activities, one for forest investment program activities, and one for licensee submissions. This will change in the future, where the forest investment program risk version will be integrated into the government-funded version. There are subtle differences between these versions, so please ensure you're referencing the appropriate version. Also, just an FYI, there is a new 2023 licensee risk doc, so check it out. Now I'm going to pass it back to Tessa to cover some background information. This will help rationalize the reporting changes.
At the beginning, I mentioned that the Free Growing Working Group is driving these changes. The purpose of the group is to review the current free growing framework in British Columbia and to provide options and recommendations for potential enhancements that will better support stand and forest level information needs. We started with a data needs assessment, where we asked various program areas like wildfire, carbon, wildlife, and growth and yield questions like, what data do you currently use? Does it need to be modified to better support your needs? Is there anything else that you need? And we got a lot of meaningful feedback. That feedback informed all the silviculture survey changes that were released in 2022 and 2023. It's also informing what we're releasing today. If you've seen my presentations explaining the silviculture survey changes, this slide will be familiar. It shows how our yield curves are developed for timber supply review. This process was introduced in 2017. It's a data-driven approach that results in the development of a unique yield curve for every feature in the timber harvesting land base. For managed stands, it uses your planting information and your forest cover inventory information. Despite this massive change in the yield curve development process, results reporting and the survey procedures weren't immediately updated. And that's created some challenges because, one, It uses planting information, but most licensees don't submit planting spatial or data at the treatment unit level. 2, the forest cover spatial and results is challenging to work with due to road tubes and spatial slivers. And 3, the process uses inventory information, but the precision was deemed too low. That's now been mostly addressed with the 2023 Silviculture Survey procedure changes. However, we still aren't providing them with temporal or spatial distribution of total stems. So if we want to improve the accuracy of the timber supply review, we need to start addressing these issues. All right, next, to understand why the changes are happening, you need to have a basic understanding of the VRI, the Vegetation Resources Inventory. All of our results forest cover submissions are processed and used to update the VRI. The forest cover submission does not need to be associated with a legal milestone. It simply uses the most recent forest cover and results. However, there is an important difference in the VRI update process between free growing and non-free growing openings. So for non-free growing openings, non-free growing forest covers, they don't want to spend a huge amount of time doing the VRI update because there's going to be another forest cover update in a few years at free growing. As a result, the forest cover of the largest stratum is generalized to the entire opening. So for the example on the screen, SUA is larger than SUB. So even if SUA is 100% Douglas fir and SUB is 100% Western red cedar, SUA's inventory attributes would be assigned to the entire opening. So the entire opening would show up as Douglas fir. Now this obviously leads to inaccuracies and it introduces errors. You might wonder, how is this simpler than just maintaining 2 strata? And it's linked to road tubes. So these are the road tubes right here. And I'll start explaining why on the next slide. Once the block achieves free growing status, it's unlikely to have more forest cover reporting. So it's then worth it for the Forest Analysis and Inventory Branch, otherwise known as FABE, to maintain the stratum boundaries. This requires FABE staff to manually clean the internal stratum line work. So if an opening gets submitted with spatial roads to results, like this image on the left, so these are the road tubes right here and here, then someone has to manually remove these road tubes. A GIS analyst has to actually snap the stratum boundary across the road tube right here, which is clearly not an efficient process given we get thousands of submissions each year. So you might be wondering if there's a way to automate this process so someone doesn't need to manually fix the spatial work on every block. Fortunately, the answer is no. FABE, the Forest Analysis and Inventory Branch, has put significant effort into trying to automate the road tube removal process, and it hasn't been possible. But there is a way to maintain the stratum forest cover information, and it's nothing new. It's always been an option. It just wasn't highlighted as the preferred option. In fact, 40% of submissions already do it this way. The solution involves reporting roads as non-mappable area, like in the image on the right-hand side. So you see the roads here, but there's no spatial line work. So if all roads were reported as non-mappable area, it would make it much easier to add Silviculture Survey Spatial to the VRI, and it would be possible to maintain the internal stratum line work. So over this past winter, FABE updated the VRIMS application to recognize results forest cover submissions without road tubes, and they will now be handled differently. Any submissions without road tubes will be integrated as submitted without generalizing to the largest standards unit. This will improve the quality of the inventory for our young stands, and it will improve the efficiency of our inventory update process. So if you're able to report forest covers without road tubes right now, the benefits will be realized right away. Okay, given all that, Ellery will now outline the new recommended practices for spatial reporting, starting off with non-map components for forest cover, opening definition, and disturbance reports.
Okay, let's begin. So most people are likely aware of this first BMP because it was released last summer. The results team emailed all users, letting them know that it is a best management practice to submit roads as non-mappable area. The email included the document shown on this slide. It was also posted to the Results Business and Policy Documentation webpage under Submission Procedures. You may want to check it out. It is called Forest Cover Updates, Submitting In-Block Roads, Trails, and Landings to Results. I want to clarify a few things from this document. 1. Seismic lines are included in this category of non-spatial. Their line work would create the same issues as roads, trails, landings. 2. This BMP applies to opening definition, forest cover, and disturbance reporting. Thirdly, you can include road tubes in your activity spatial reporting. 4. Also, this BMP only applies to new openings. There's no expectation to clean up spatial that's already been reported to results. Similarly, if you have a block that's not yet reported to results, but the spatial is already built in your internal database, there's no expectation to redo it. However, if there's an easy fix to be able to report the forest cover spatial without roads, it is a best practice. And 5, at last, you still need to provide tabular information associated with the area occupied by these features. I'll show an example of this on one of the next slides. Some of the databases already have the option to report roads as non-mapped area, and this will be an easy change for those users to adopt. For other databases, this is a more significant change. If you haven't already, you'll need to reach out to your database provider to discuss solutions. Some licensees submitted a coordinated ticket to the database provider, and it sounds like there was a workable solution. Here is an example of reporting road spatially. As you can see, we have road tube spatials through our forest cover spatial. There is no information in the non-mapped area table. They have been reported as polygon SAD, as shown here. This is what we want to remove for reporting. Now here is an example of what we need. The opening has in-block roads, but you can't see it in the forest cover spatial. There are no road tubes. The roads have been reported as non-mapped area. You can see it when you open the forest cover for SU, A, and B, right here. You can also see it in the main forest cover table, this row. In this case, the non-map area plus the net area equals the gross area.
Okay, that covers off how to submit spatial for forest cover, opening definition, and disturbance reports. We're now going to cover spatial reporting for silviculture treatments. All right, I'm going to start off by outlining the current requirements. So right now, activity spatial is required for government-funded treatments. So if you've previously completed planting under Section 108, then you would have needed to report spatial. But for treatments under all other funding sources, activity spatial is only optional. As a result, it rarely gets submitted. Ellery will go over the exact details in a second, but we are making it a best management practice to report activity spatial for all funding sources. This is a critical change to facilitate long-term effectiveness monitoring. Right now, we truly can't do it unless we reach out to licensees for activity spatial, and this can be challenging. We often don't have appropriate contact info, and many companies don't keep treatment maps from 20 plus years ago. This is especially true when companies go bankrupt or when a license changes hands. There are lots of other reasons too. Activity spatial would make things way easier for FIRB, the Forest Investment and Reporting Branch, to identify areas for government-funded stand tending treatments, which would benefit all of us. Planting spatial would be particularly useful. With it, we could track the use of improved seed and link forest health to seed use. We could also track enhanced basic silviculture and monitor the outcomes of climate-based seed transfer. Also, as I previously mentioned, planting information is very important for the yield curve development process. With Spatial, this development process could become more accurate and detailed. Now, for a quick example, I was doing post-regrowing monitoring on Haida this past summer. We were looking at the effectiveness of different silviculture treatments at producing cedar stands, and we wanted to see if various types of protectors were breaking down over time. Most of our sample blocks were established in the late 80s and early 90s. None of them were fully planted, and the planting tended to happen over 3 to 5 treatments. Without Spatial, it was impossible to understand what was planted and what was naturally regenerated. If there was cedar planted, we didn't know if it was concentrated within a small area or distributed throughout. Those are really important differences for growth and yield, and this photo is a great example of that, where you have a large spruce and a really small cedar adjacent. We were also finding that some types of protectors aren't breaking down, even though it's been 25 plus years since planting. If we want to put together a contract to get these protectors removed to prevent tree damage or mortality, it's going to be costly because our crews will need to walk extra ground in efforts to find these protectors since we don't have Spatial.
To address this concern Teza has talked about, the best management practice is to submit spatials for new silviculture treatments to results. It'll apply for the listed base codes. We're expecting to add this to the risks in 2025, which will make it mandatory. Now, there are quite a few exemptions from this BMP and the future legal requirement. The most important one relates to woodlot licensees. This will remain as a BMP for woodlots. We're not planning on changing the risk. The other exemptions relate to specific technique and activity methods, typically where it wouldn't be feasible or worthwhile to map them out. For example, there's no point receiving Spatial for the layout of an activity. Instead, we want the Spatial for the completed treatment. We'll also exempt roadside planting and slide planting from this Spatial requirement. They're both small areas, typically, and hard to map. There's a lot of site preparation techniques that are exempt. For the full list, check out the Results Planned Reporting Updates document on the Results webpage. For this example, there are 3 treatment unit polygons in the same opening that when reported should show in results as separate polygons. I also want to point out that activity spatial can include road tubes. Your roads can be spatial or aspatial. It does not matter. You just have to ensure that the road area is excluded from your reported treated area.
All right, that wraps up changes to spatial reporting. We are now going to talk about tree planting, starting with technique codes. Okay, as a quick reminder, in results, your activities have a base code, a technique code, and a method code. I'm going to be focused on the technique codes associated with the base code of plant, PL. So I have these technique codes listed on the slide. There are 8 possible technique codes, but I'm only going to talk about 6 of them. That's because we do not want to see chemical ground or seedling protection reported under the base code of PL. We need to just clean up this list. Instead, chemical ground should be under the base code BR for brushing, and seedling protection should be under the base code pest control PC. So right now, there are no definitions for these technique codes, and we'd like to change that. When I started talking with licensees about these changes, I asked for their current interpretations of the technique codes. I have some of the results shown using pie graphs on the upcoming slides, and you can also see a few right here. There's clearly been a really wide range of interpretations. This is also evident in results. It's to the point where we can't do meaningful data analysis. It means that we can't fully understand current practices or silviculture regimes. It's also an issue for appraisal, given licensees submit average costs by technique code, and the process uses results activity reporting. It can also have an impact on growth and yield modeling. Once the codes are standardized, we will be able to develop yield curves differently depending on the technique codes. And lastly, having different interpretations of these technique codes makes it really hard to roll out changes. Like today, certain technique codes will be exempt from upcoming spatial and stratification requirements. So overall, there's a real need for consistency.
Okay, moving on. When we asked licensees how long it would take to adopt new terminology, the responses were between 6 months and 1 year. So we plan to incorporate these planting technique definitions into the RIS in 2025. At that point, they will become a requirement, not a BMP. So what exactly are they? It'll start with the 3 most common techniques: plant, replant, and fill. A plant is defined as completed planting density greater or equal to 80% of target stocking, which is the first plant at site. Replant is defined as completed planting density greater or equal to 80% of target stocking standard previously planted. And fill plant, completed planting density less than 80% of target stocking, first plant, on site, or previously planted. To distinguish between these three, you need to compare the actual completed planting density to the free-growing target stocking standard. You also need to check if it's the first plant on the area or a subsequent plant. So to start, you'll ask if the planting density is greater than or equal to 80% of the free-growing target stocking standard. If your target is 900, that'd be 720 stems per hectare. If your target is 1200, the 80% threshold would be 960 stems per hectare. If your planting density is less than 80% of the target, then your planting technique will be a fill plant. If your planting density is greater or equal to 80% of the target, then you need to check if it's the first plant on the area. If it is, then it is called a plant. If it's not, if it's already been planted once or multiple times, then it's a replant. These technique codes can include road rehab areas, burn holes, or even slides, if they're being planted at the same time as the main planting unit. This flow diagram will help determine which planting technique applies. Now, sometimes you're just planting the rehabilitated road or burn hole area, but not the surrounding area. In that situation, the codes may be different. So if your target area is specifically 1, rehab roads, 2, burn holes roadside, or 3, slide areas, you are not planting the surrounding area simultaneously. Then your technique code options are road rehab for rehab roads, roadside for your roadside and burn holes, and slide for slides. Back to Tasia.
Okay, we're going to try to explain these definitions better by using a handful of examples. For every example, the free-growing target stocking standard will be 1,200 stems per hectare. Now for this first example, we have a block that was planted to 1,200 stems per hectare, the target, in 2021. Of course, that was the heat dome year and it was badly affected. You find that there's only 100 well-spaced stems per hectare during your 2022 survival survey. So you planted again in 2023 at 1,100 stems per hectare. So what do you call this 2023 plant? Well, I was curious to know what most licensees would call this plant right now. To find out, I posted a survey with these examples and asked one representative from each company to fill it out. And you can see the results right here in this pie graph. So clearly, most licensees would call it a replant. And that's good because we'll now be calling it a replant based on the definitions on the last slide. It will be called a replant because it was previously planted, and the 2023 planting density is greater than 960 stems per hectare, which would be equivalent to 80% of the target stocking standard. So this is meaningful for the yield curve development process. Whenever a replant code is added, the initial plant information will not be used for the yield curve development process. Instead, it will be based on the replant information. So that is a key difference between replants and fill plants. Okay, here's another example. You again completed an initial plant in 2021, planting at 1,200 stems per hectare. During your survival survey, your stratum passes, but there are some non-stratifiable NSR pockets. You prescribed this opening for 350 stems per hectare in 2023 to bring the well space density back up to target. When we asked licensees what they'd call this plant, there was a high level of inconsistency across licensees and even across divisions. Most were calling it a fill plant, but a good number of people were also calling it a replant. Now going forward, the consensus will win. It will be considered a fill plant because the planting density will be less than 80% of the target stocking standard, less than 960 stems per hectare. It's really important to understand that the stocking status and your regime are irrelevant with these new definitions. Okay, example 3. Here we have a block that came back NSR during the 2022 survival survey. To make it pass again, the forester prescribes 600 stems per hectare for a 2023 plant. When we asked licensees what they call this plant, we got almost an even split between fill plant and replant. This example really demonstrates why standardized definitions are so important. So going forward, we will be calling this a fill plant, like the last example. Its NSR status does not matter. All that matters is that the planting density will be below 80% of the target stocking standard. All right, next we have a block that was fully planted in spring 2021. Unfortunately, we didn't manage to complete pile burning until fall 2021, so we need to return in spring 2022 just to plant the burn holes. The whole remainder of the area has already been planted. So when we asked licensees what they call this type of plant, we found that most licensees were calling this roadside, but some were using the planting or fill planting technique codes. So going forward, we will be calling this a roadside plant, and that's because we're only targeting burn holes in this situation. The whole surrounding area is not being planted. It was already established. Now, if burning had happened in 2020, prior to the initial plant, then we wouldn't need to stratify out these burn holes and call it something different. The whole NAR would simply be called a plant, a PL. We're only stratifying it and calling it something else because we're not planting the surrounding area. We're just focused on the burn holes. Okay, next example. You harvested block MNO in 2017. You left it for natural regeneration. You survey it 4 years later, and you create 2 stratum. Stratum A is NSR with 300 well-spaced stems per hectare. So you prescribe it for a 900 stem per hectare plant. Stratum B is SR with 780 stems per hectare well space, but it could still benefit from planting, so you prescribe it for 500 stems per hectare. This example led to very divided results. It was almost an even split between plant and fill plant. Going forward, we will be calling this a fill plant. Again, it does not matter that it's associated with a natural regeneration regime or that its status is NSR. The stratum hasn't been planted previously, so your options are just fill plant or plant. Since the planting density is less than 80% of the target stocking standard, it has to be a fill plant. All right, next, what do you call the plant on stratum B? It has 500 plantable spots. This led to more consistent results across licensees. Almost everybody would call it a fill plant. That again aligns with our new definition. Since planting density is below 80% of the target, it would indeed be a fill plant. Okay, our final example. You prescribe this block for 1,200 stems per hectare, but when the planters get there, they find dense naturals and they only manage to squeeze in 500 stems per hectare based on your planting specs. So, what should you call this plant? When we asked licensees what they'd call this plant, everyone said plant or fill plant, and both are understandable. However, going forward, this will be called a fill plant. It doesn't matter that it was intended for 1,200 stems per hectare. The final planting density was less than 80% of the target stalking standard, so it should be called a fill plant. The outcome is more important than the intent for growth and yield modeling and appraisal. So sometimes you may need to change your coding following planting if unexpected conditions arise. Actually, we're going to do one more example to demonstrate how these codes work when enhanced basic silviculture applies. So block STU has enhanced basic silviculture standards. It was planted to 1,800 stems per hectare in 2021. Unfortunately, that was the year of the heat dome and almost everything died. The surveyors only found 100 stems per hectare well spaced during their survival survey in 2022. So they prescribe 1,100 stems per hectare for a spring 2023 plant to bring the opening back up to the free-growing target stalking standard. So what should this planting activity be called? Well, this opening was previously planted, so it's either a fill or a replant. To distinguish between the two, we now need to compare the planting density to the free-growing target stalking standard. So 1,100 stems per hectare divided by 1,200 equals 0.92. So this planting treatment will be classified as a replant. Now, if we had divided our planting density by the enhanced basic target planting density, or possibly a region delay target stalking standard, we would have classified this plant as a fill plant instead. So it's important to remember that these technique code definitions use the free-growing target stalking standard. Now that we have standardized technique codes, we can roll out some best management practices related to planting, starting with objective codes. This is being released as a best management practice now, but it will become mandatory in 2024. For drought or frost-caused replants and fill plants, you will need to report the objective code. The objective code will be equivalent to the Forest Health Code. So for drought-caused fill or replants, the objective code will be ND. For frost-caused fill or replants, the objective code will be NG. Now, sometimes a replant or fill plant might be caused by compounding factors, like drought plus elk damage. If drought was a major factor or a leading cause for why the replant or fill plant is happening, then report the objective code as drought. We aren't setting a numeric threshold for this because we don't want to increase work for you during your surveys. Now, if you want to report any other causes of replants or fill plants, you can, but it is entirely optional. It's not a best management practice. As a warning, the objective code list isn't as comprehensive as the Forest Health Code list. So you may have to use A for animal instead of AE for elk, or IW for insect weevil versus IWC for conifer seedling weevil. So why are we introducing this best management practice? Well, it was actually proposed by industry through the Interior Silviculture Subcommittee's Drought Working Group. They want to better understand where drought is an issue and the impact of drought. They will also be examining practices, regimes, and silvicultural systems to determine strategies to lead to higher establishment success levels in areas of high drought hazard. Reporting the objective codes is a good first step for them. This reporting will also facilitate greater monitoring of CBST, climate-based seed transfer. All right, we're now going to move into our final best management practice. And it relates to planting stratification. Now, I know most of you stratify your planting treatments already. You might stratify them by technique, species, density, seed lots, spatial distribution, etc. And in your internal database and in Plant Wizard, you might have several planting units per opening. But depending on your database schema, when you report your planting activity to results, all that stratification disappears. The activity becomes a single activity treatment unit, and all your planting units are combined. They simply get blended together. That's always been technically okay because there were no stratification requirements listed in the results information submission specifications. So, what has this led to? Well, you could have an opening with two very distinct planting units. This area could be 100% pine at 1,600 stems per hectare. This area could be 100% spruce at 1,200 stems per hectare. But when it's reported results, everything would be combined. That's obviously problematic given our yield curve development process is heavily reliant on planting information. And an intimately mixed pine spruce stand would grow very differently than if it's managed as two single species units. So here's a real example from results. This is an 81.5 hectare cut block, two SUs. SU1 is an even-aged SU. SU2 was partial cut. There's 8 meters square per hectare dispersed. Based on the results activity report, 4 species and 8 seedlots were planted across this opening, and on average, 1,264 stems per hectare were planted. But was that an even 1,264 stems per hectare? If 8 meters square per hectare was retained in SU2, it would make sense that it would have a lower planting density, but we don't know. Also, was there a reason for having so many seed lots? Were specific seed lots being targeted in portions of the block to meet CBST rules? We don't know. And then lastly, were the fir, larch, pine, and spruce intermixed, or were they being managed in discrete units?
When there's variation in planting attributes across an opening, like in that first example, the accuracy of our yield projections could be improved by having planting spatial and more detailed stratification. In turn, this could facilitate effective monitoring, silviculture investment decisions, carbon modeling, and TSR. Given that, we are introducing stratification requirements. If there are differences in your planting attributes, such as density, spacing, species composition, etc., across your standards units, then you will need to report your planting at minimum by standards unit. When does stratification not apply? If you're operating in a woodlot, if your planting activity has a technique code slide, roadside, or road rehab, there are no stratification expectations. And lastly, if your planting treatment is uniform across standards units. If there isn't any substantial change in your planting attributes, then stratification is not necessary. I'll show an example of this on the next slide. This BMP will only apply to new planting activities. There is no expectation to clean up or re-report planting activities that are already completed. Similarly, if a standards unit boundary changes post-planting due to a site plan amendment, there is no expectation to re-report planting activity according to the revised SU boundaries.
Here is a quick example. For this opening, we have two standards units. Clearly, they've been planted with different species. SUA was planted with Douglas fir and pine, and SUB was planted with red alder. Now, if this was a new planting treatment, it would no longer be acceptable to report this planting as a single activity treatment unit with all the planting attributes rolled up to the opening level. Instead, at minimum, you would have to report 2 activity treatment units to results, one for each SU. So that's the minimum expectation. Now, I fully expect that you'll have some standard units with multiple planting units. For this example, maybe SUA was actually managed as 2 treatment units. TU1 has a fir pine mix, and TU2 is straight Douglas fir. If that's the case, if you've done this stratification, the boundaries right here, please do not merge your planting units together to report them at the SU level. That would be an additional step for you, and it wouldn't help us. So instead, just keep your stratification and report each treatment unit. So for this example, you'd report 3 activity treatment units, one for each treatment unit. So 1, 2, and 3. Okay, here's a final example. This opening has 2 standards units. For the planted area, the planters maintained an even distribution of hemlock and cedar across the entire area with no change in density or seed lots. There was also no substantial difference in the planting attributes or outcome between the SUs. As such, planting stratification is not required. This could be submitted as a single ATU. Now, if there was a substantial variation between the SUs, then it would be reported as 2 ATUs according to the BMP.
For some databases and for some reporting tools, it's possible to meet this BMP right now. For example, it's possible with Phoenix, FME, and EasyLink. You can see that in this example, with this opening, there's a single planting activity in the licensee's database. However, this singular activity has 2 planting units, a 7-hectare unit and a 4.7-hectare unit, where each has a unique prescription with different attributes. When this activity got reported as results, each planting unit became an activity treatment unit, so the stratification was maintained. You can see that right here. This is exactly what we want. And for the licensee, they didn't have to do anything special. It took no extra work for them. That's because their database reporting schema is written so that each treatment unit turns into a separate activity treatment unit in results. So when you're talking to your database provider, that's what you need to be asking for. Once they update things behind the scenes for you, your planting stratification will be reported and maintained in results. And hopefully, this will cause minimal to no impact if you've already been stratifying when there's changes in planting attributes. If that's not done, you would need to have each planting unit in your database as a separate activity to get them to become a separate ATU in results. Obviously, that's not very efficient, nor is it expected at this time. Like I just mentioned, reporting each planting or treatment unit as a separate ATU in results isn't a great solution. So our product management team is working to make this cleaner and more efficient for the future. The vision is that you'd submit a single activity that is associated with multiple planting or treatment units. This should be possible with upcoming changes to our reporting database sometime between 2024 and 2025. Once our database allows this, we will then make this a mandatory requirement.
All right, that's a wrap. So in summary, the reporting changes are needed to improve the provincial inventory and the accuracy of our timber supply review. They will also support effectiveness in implementation monitoring, which is really exciting. Nothing is being made mandatory immediately. We want to allow transition time. Everything is just being released as a best management practice right now. We do expect them to become requirements in the future, probably 1 to 3 years. These timelines are being informed by the feedback we've received from licensees. As they become mandatory, they will be incorporated into the results information submission specification documents. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for doing this training. If you have any questions, please reach out. I'd be happy to help answer any questions about why the changes are happening. For pretty much everything else, Ellery is your contact. He is the main point person now for all things results. So if you need to better understand how to actually implement these changes, how to adopt these BMPs, send him an email, give him a call. His contact info is on the slide. We're really grateful to have him in our team now.